The Big Mac Index of History. What would lunch cost a Roman, a sultan, or a medieval peasant? In 1986, an editor at The Economist magazine came up with a deceptively simple idea. Instead of comparing currencies using complicated exchange rate formulas, why not compare them using something everyone in the world already understood? A Big Mac. The logic was elegant. A Big Mac is basically the same product almost everywhere on Earth, made with roughly the same ingredients, sold in roughly the same kind of restaurant. So if you compare how many hours of local wages it takes to buy one in different countries, you get a surprisingly honest snapshot of what money is actually worth to the person spending it. That idea became known as the Big Mac Index, and economists still use it today as a lighthearted but genuinely useful tool for understanding purchasing power. So here's the question we're going to ask in this video. What if we took that same idea and pointed it backward in time? Not literally, since obviously no one was flipping beef patties in ancient Rome. But if we take the core concept, how many hours of an ordinary worker's labor would it take to afford a solid, filling meal and apply it across history? What does that tell us about how rich or poor ordinary people actually were compared to today? Let's start in ancient Rome, somewhere around the height of the empire in the 2nd century. An unskilled laborer in Rome, someone doing basic manual work, might earn somewhere in the range of a few sesterces per day, depending on the exact period and region. Now, a basic filling meal in Rome, bread, some olive oil, maybe a bit of cheese or salted fish, wasn't extravagantly expensive relative to that wage. Based on surviving price records from places like Pompeii, historians estimate an ordinary worker could cover a decent daily meal with something like 1/10 to 1/8 of a day's wage. Translate that into our modern comparison. If we imagine a Big Mac as standing in for a solid, filling meal, a Roman laborer might have needed to work somewhere around 45 minutes to an hour to afford the equivalent. That's actually not far off from where a lot of the world sits today, which is the first surprising thing this exercise reveals. Basic caloric survival, in terms of raw labor time, hasn't necessarily improved as dramatically as we might assume, at least not for the poorest workers throughout history. What has changed dramatically is everything above basic survival, but we'll get to that. Now let's jump forward to medieval Europe, somewhere around the 13th or 14th century, on a typical manor in England or France. Here, the picture gets more complicated because most peasants weren't paid a daily cash wage in the way we think of wages today. Much of their compensation came in the form of land use rights, in exchange for labor owed to a lord, along with whatever they grew for themselves. When cash wages did exist, for a day laborer or a hired hand, records suggest something in the range of 1 to 3 pence per day in parts of medieval England, depending heavily on the period and location. A loaf of bread, the actual dietary backbone of medieval life, might cost a fraction of a penny in a good harvest year, but prices could spike dramatically after a poor harvest or during a famine, sometimes by 3 or 4 times in a single bad season. In a normal year, a laborer might need something like 15 to 20 minutes of labor to afford enough bread for a filling meal. In a famine year, that same meal could suddenly cost several hours of labor or become genuinely unaffordable altogether. This is actually one of the most important things this kind of comparison reveals about the medieval period specifically. It wasn't just that people were poor. It's that their food costs were wildly unstable from one year to the next, in a way that's almost unimaginable to someone living in a modern economy with a reasonably stable food supply chain. A medieval peasant's Big Mac Index wasn't a steady number. It was a number that could triple or quadruple overnight if the rains didn't come at the right time. Now let's head east to the Ottoman Empire, somewhere around the 16th or 17th century, during one of its periods of greatest strength and stability. An ordinary unskilled worker or day laborer in Istanbul during this period might earn somewhere in the range of a few aki per day, the empire's standard silver coin at the time. Records from Ottoman price registers, which were unusually detailed for their era because the state actively regulated prices on staple goods, suggest that a basic filling meal, bread, some olives, perhaps a bit of cheese, or a simple stew could be purchased for a relatively modest fraction of that daily wage, often somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 minutes of labor under stable conditions. What's particularly interesting about the Ottoman case is that the empire ran a formal price-fixing system called nar, where local officials set maximum prices for bread and other essentials specifically to prevent merchants from exploiting shortages. This means that, at least on paper, an Ottoman worker's food costs were often more predictable than a medieval European peasant's, even if the overall wage itself wasn't necessarily higher. Stability, it turns out, matters almost as much as the raw price when you're trying to plan whether you can actually afford to eat well this month. Let's jump to a very different setting. Colonial America, sometime in the mid-18th century in a city like Philadelphia or Boston. A typical laborer here might earn somewhere around 2 to 3 shillings per day, and a basic filling meal, bread, meat, some vegetables, might cost a portion of that wage, translating to roughly 20 to 30 minutes of labor, similar in rough terms to the Ottoman example. Colonial America's relatively abundant land and agricultural productivity, compared to crowded parts of Europe at the time, generally meant food costs stayed a bit more favorable relative to wages than in many contemporary European cities, which is actually one of the underlying economic factors that made colonial life attractive to European immigrants in the first place. Now here's where the story gets genuinely interesting. The Industrial Revolution, roughly the early to mid-19th century, particularly in a rapidly industrializing city like Manchester or London. This period is often remembered, correctly, for brutal working conditions in early factories. But the purely numerical relationship between wages and food costs actually tells a slightly more complicated story than the popular image suggests. Skilled factory workers in Britain by the mid-1800s could sometimes afford a filling meal for something in the range of 15 to 20 minutes of labor, an improvement over the medieval baseline, largely because industrialization was also transforming agriculture and food transportation, making staple foods somewhat cheaper and more consistently available in growing cities. But this average hides enormous inequality. Unskilled laborers, particularly women and children working in textile mills, often earn dramatically less than skilled male workers for the same number of hours, meaning their personal meal in minutes of labor number could be 2 or 3 times worse than their better-paid neighbor working the very same factory floor. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how much food cost relative to wages. It dramatically widened the gap between what different workers within the very same city and the very same industry could actually afford. Now let's bring this all the way forward to the 20th century, specifically the period right after World War II, when the modern fast food industry itself was being born in the United States. By the 1950s, an average American factory worker earned something in the range of $2 an hour. A basic filling meal at a diner. Not yet a Big Mac specifically, since McDonald's hadn't introduced it yet, but a comparable burger, fries, and a drink cost somewhere around $1. That's roughly 30 minutes of labor for a filling meal, a number that's remarkably close to several of our historical examples, which is itself a striking observation. In raw labor time terms, an ordinary meal in 1950s America wasn't dramatically cheaper than an ordinary. So now let's finally get to the actual Big Mac itself, introduced by McDonald's in 1967, and trace it through to today. In the late 1960s, when the Big Mac first launched, it cost around 49 cents at a time when average hourly wages in the United States were somewhere around $3. That works out to roughly 10 minutes of labor for a Big Mac, a genuinely significant improvement compared to almost every historical example we've looked at so far. By the 1980s, when The Economist actually invented the Big Mac Index as a formal economic tool, the burger cost around $1.60 against average hourly wages of roughly $8, still landing at around 12 minutes of labor. Through the 1990s and 2000s, this number stayed remarkably stable, generally hovering somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes of an average worker's time. Today, in most of the United States, a Big Mac costs somewhere in the range of $5 to $6, against an average hourly wage that's climbed to somewhere around $35 for the median full-time worker. That works out as somewhere around 8 to 10 minutes of labor, meaning that in pure labor time terms, buying a filling meal in America today is genuinely, measurably easier than it's been for most of human history that we can actually reconstruct data for. But here's where this comparison gets genuinely important, rather than just being a fun historical trivia exercise. This improvement has not been remotely equal across the world. In many lower-income countries today, the exact same Big Mac, or an equivalent local fast food meal, can require several hours of an average worker's labor to afford, not minutes. In parts of South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, some economic studies estimate a comparable meal can cost the equivalent of 2 to 4 hours of local minimum wage labor, putting the relative burden closer to a medieval European peasant during a difficult harvest year than to a modern American factory worker. This is actually the real insight sitting underneath this entire historical exercise. The story of human economic progress isn't really a smooth, steady line where everyone gradually got richer together. It's much closer to a series of dramatic breakthroughs, industrialization, agricultural technology, global trade networks that happened at wildly different times in different parts of the world, and in some cases are still happening right now. A Roman laborer and someone living in extreme poverty in parts of the world today might, in pure labor time terms, be closer to each other on this scale than either of them is to an average worker in a wealthy country in 2026. There's also a subtler point buried in this comparison, one that's easy to miss if you only look at the raw minutes of labor required. What counted as a filling meal changed dramatically across these eras too. A Roman worker's bread and olive oil, a medieval peasant's bread and pottage, an Ottoman worker's bread and stew, these were nutritionally adequate but relatively narrow diets, built around whatever staple crop dominated the local agricultural system. A Big Mac, whatever you think of its nutritional merits, represents something genuinely different. Beef, wheat, dairy, and vegetables from potentially several different countries, transported, processed, and assembled within hours of being sold. The fact that this level of complexity can be purchased for roughly 10 minutes of an average worker's time isn't just a story about wages rising. It's a story about an entire global supply chain becoming efficient enough to make that complexity almost invisible to the person eating the meal. So what do we actually learn by running this slightly absurd thought experiment? Chasing a fast food burger across 2,000 years of human history? Partly, it's a reminder that the basic question, how hard do you have to work to simply eat, is one of the oldest and most consistent measures of genuine prosperity throughout human history, arguably more honest than looking at total wealth, total GDP, or any of the more abstract numbers economists typically use. And partly, it's a reminder that the dramatic improvement we associate with modern life, the idea that food is now cheap and abundant, is a genuinely recent and genuinely uneven achievement, one that took thousands of years of technological, agricultural, and economic development to arrive at, and one that a significant portion of the world population still hasn't fully caught up to, even now. The next time you're standing in line at a fast food counter, mildly annoyed that a burger costs a few dollars more than it used to, it might be worth remembering this. For most of human history, in most of the places humans have lived, simply affording a filling meal was never something you could take for granted. The fact that, for many of us today, it takes less time to earn than a single episode of a television show is in the very long arc of economic history, an almost shockingly recent and almost shockingly fragile achievement.